Hey everybody, this is Elle Nagy from the Unapologetic Women Empowerment Dynasty, and you're listening to the Unapologetic Women podcast, the show for women who choose to live their legacies unleashed, unlimited, and unapologetic. If this is a space you're curious about, visit unapologetic-women.com. Today we're talking about The Way of Joy with Vicki Dello Joio. Vicki draws on decades of theatre performing and directing experience, along with her lifelong study of martial arts, to fire up visionary speakers, entrepreneurs, visionary leaders, lawyers, keynoters, to amplify their charisma and deliver their message with passion, presence, and power. A seasoned transformational speaker herself, Vicki's method for both crafting stories and her focus on the energy behind how they are told have touched and transformed hundreds of speakers to stand and deliver with joy, confidence, and ease. In addition, as a recipient of the Women's Martial Artists Instructor Hall of Fame, Vicki is also a Qigong master teacher whose spiritual fitness program and book, The Way of Joy, has transformed the lives of thousands of participants since 1975. Thanks for joining us. This conversation with Vicki is rich and a true banquet of wisdom. Oh my goodness. I think one of the most joyous things that I'm finding of living at this time is how women are opening up their connections and how we are connecting forward in a way that we haven't done in a long time. And so I do want to give a shout out to our mutual friends, Christine Campbell Rappin, for making this introduction. And Christine was one of my very first guests on the podcast as well. So if you haven't listened to her episode, I'll drop the link in afterwards. But what a powerhouse woman. One of those that when I first met her, I was just like, wow, I get to play on the planet with you. And so when she does make an introduction, I always pay attention. And I have to say, she gets it spot on every time, Vicki. So
Christine is an amazing intuitive and a go-getter, right? She just is amazing how she's a connector, she's a transformative person. Really so appreciate her and being introduced to you, because it's been such a joy already to connect with you.
Oh, I think that it's miraculous how we as like-hearted women, and I always say like-hearted, not like-minded, because we get to have our own worldview and be enriched when we are open to the worldview of others without needing to change our own, right? It's not that, oh my God, now I have to think differently. But no, I love how we get to experience the world through each other's eyes and view and values, and not having to need them to be the same, but we all come from love.
Yes, there's a saying that I had a Qigong teacher who used to say that, we're all part of this big cosmic gem, and each of us is a different facet on that gem. That's why we each have a different face and a different way of expressing ourselves and a different way of expressing from that gem. That gem could be the heart connections that we might have in a state of interbeing, and to be able to express the individuality through that in connection with others is, I think that's part of why we're on the planet.
And why not? Why not play together?
Yeah,
it's a big planet. It's like
it is.
Amazed that
and here we are across the globe from one another.
Yes, and thank God for technology. I was thinking about it this morning because I've just launched a new platform, a membership platform, and I was going, how cool is it? I was really connecting to this. I was wanting to create a community space. The amount of inner beings and spiritual guides and people who are playing along to create our desires is mind-blowing to me. And I started going into the amount of technology that had to be created for me to get to this moment in time of creating the space, right? From the internet to laptops to cell phones to apps on cell phones to people who are creating these community platforms for us to use, the programmers, the developers, the visionaries. The social media, the people introduce, like when you start thinking about how much is involved in creating our desires and that we are all doing it together as team humanity and team spirit, team, whatever we want to call it. Holy moly. It makes me humble, right? It makes me humble that we all get to play together to create our desires and our preferences.
Yes, and to be in an evolutionary process through this whole time. So it's also creating our desires and then the evolution of where those desires can take us next. It's pretty astounding.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, darling, let's get started with the question of all questions on this podcast. What does it mean to you to be an unapologetic woman?
I love that question. I've heard you ask it before, and I've loved musing on it. I would say for me, being unapologetic means standing really in the center of what I call your power presence, to be able to really own that you have something unique to offer, and to be able to really have the empowerment and the inspiration to bring those two things together so that that can happen. So unapologetic means that point at which we are truly aligned between vision, heart connection, and action. Then I think that there's no longer anything that has anything to do with apology. That's simply being. And I think that at least from my generation, because I'm a little older than you, I think there's definitely had to be some deep programming in that, because when I was coming up, the women were really just there to serve others, period. There was nothing, I mean, and I believe in service, but it was a way in which it was a self-abnegating, I don't exist, or excuse me for taking a moment to share my voice. And that I think has evolved over time and is continuing to evolve, much to my delight. But I think that the bottom line has to do with where we stand inside of our own power.
I absolutely adore this. And it's interesting that you talk about the service and the servitude conditioning. By the way, I went through it as well. And I think even more so in the culture that I grew up in, which is the Afrikaans culture, where it's very much a child is not to be, well, quite frankly, heard or seen. I never understood what I'm supposed to be doing. There's the joke of a woman should be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. It's all about being behind your man. It's all about apologizing. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I upset you? Did I say the wrong thing? Am I standing in the wrong space? Am I taking up too much space in the world? And if I wanted to receive, I had to first give. So it was a very contractual conditioning. And I find that it's still prevalent in today's society, especially in the business world. And one of the things that I'm loving is when I connect with younger women who are in their 20s, who are coming out of the tail end of that conditioning, and they seem to connect to self-worth in their 20s, which took me more than 40 years to connect to.
I completely agree. I see that also in young folks coming up, and it gives me great joy. I mean, it's not that they don't still have their own issues that they need to deal with, but there's a way in which I feel like, being part, for me, I was part of sort of the early feminist movement in the States, and that sense that there's, the things that I see younger people take for granted now that would have been such a far reach for me to even imagine when I was that age. It does give me that sense of being part of a process, being part of an evolution, and watching an unfolding of what I think is really the natural order, which has to do with the wisdom that women bring.
I would love to delve into the feminist movement with you, and here's why. I have always stood on the outside of the feminist movement, and more so in today's society, where my sense is that it has become very destructive of men, especially. I listen to my boys who are in their 20s, who are always referring to feminists as making them feel as though they they are in the wrong, that there's something wrong with them because they are men, that they're not welcome on the planet, that they're not welcome in the workplace, that it's an us against them scenario. And my sense is that that is not how feminism started, or that was not the ideology of feminism. I would love your experience of the upstart of the feminist movement and how you see it has changed over the generations.
Well, of course, I can't speak for feminism in general, but what I can say for my own experience is that when it started, I think there was a lot of anger, and some of that probably has carried forward. There was a lot of anger because people were so through with being silenced, and I think that there was damage done because of that anger. I mean, I was also on the outside as a young person because I was a lesbian, and that, you know, that was nicknamed the Red Menace in my era, where we were, you know, it was like, keep that closeted. We don't want to be identified as being male hating, as though lesbians were male hating. Actually, I found more anger at men from heterosexual women than I do from lesbians, who don't have to deal with some of the dynamics or the old paradigm dynamics that were happening. So I think that there has been damage done, but I also think that there's always, you know, when I think about it as a white person, that it's always useful for me, and I'm not really speaking to your boys because they're dealing with something entirely different, but it's also useful for me to look at what is privilege, and how do I own that privilege, or how do I acknowledge that privilege that I hold as, say, a white European Arab background, that what does that look like, and to actually see that there is something that I have, that I get to have, that has nothing to do with merit. It has to do with, you know, the skin I happen to be born in. And I think it's the same thing true with, you know, patriarchal privilege. And again, it's not that men don't have a voice or shouldn't be on the planet or something like that. I think that the anger is what's done that harm, and the anger came from, you know, so many years of being unheard and unseen. So I think that the anger had its place, but I do think that there, you know, I think that we're hopefully moving into a place where we can start to dialogue across difference with having that level of blame and entitlement that so many folks carry when they're talking across difference.
Yeah, it's always interesting for me to watch the pendulum swing in humanity and the patterns. And it does take generations to swing from one side to the other side, and then finally finding that harmonious balance. And I don't think it's something that we're going to see necessarily in our lifetime. But I also constantly look out for signs of how we are evolving, and sometimes just in the smallest little things. And then when you start acknowledging that everything is evolving for our highest good, everything is evolving for a state of betterment and thrive, even if it takes generations, there's hope, right? And so then it's easier for us to be in the process of the pendulum swing than to kind of think, no, everything has to change now in our lifetime, in this year, everything has to be fixed, because it's just not a realistic expectation. And I love how you appreciate appreciate privilege in whatever that privilege is. And I think that those privileges change over our lifetimes, but they also make us humble if we appreciate them, instead of coming across as, oh, of course, I get to do all of these things. I almost feel like that's a conversation that can be had, is, on the one hand, especially in the spiritual community, it's of course, I'm worthy of all of my desires. Of course, I get to have everything. But do you feel like there's a fine line between self-worth and entitlement as it's playing out at the moment?
Absolutely. I absolutely think that's true. And I think that, you know, what gets called spiritual bypass, where people, you know, go into a place of this sort of spiritual explanation of something, but without recognizing there's dynamics of power that happen all the time, and without being sensitized to what that means and how we use that power, particularly in the power over paradigm that, you know, for millennia we've been living in. So I think that I think that there's you know, this is an issue of mindfulness and awareness, and also empathy, being able to hear and listen across difference without cultivating already what it is that I'm going to say next. This really being able to stay present and listen and take information in is really an essential skill, which I hope we are developing. I feel like that's happening more and more. There's a lot that's the opposite of that happening also more and more. A lot of the, rage and the kind of illness that comes in our hearts and our minds from, whatever the effects of the pandemic was for so many people, right? Of being isolated and separated and then feeling angry in general about that and then taking that out in inappropriate ways. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really critical to be aware that yes, everything is useful. Everything can help us grow. Everything can be for betterment. And there are times when it has to do, when it comes to different types of injustices and harms, this is where we have this opportunity to really look at what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to really know we're interconnected? And what does it do when you discount somebody's reality?
Yes. What does it mean to be human? We had a beautiful young woman on the call yesterday in the soiree, and I asked everybody to make an introduction of themselves and omit what it is that they're doing, because I feel like so often we can get caught up in what we're doing instead of who we are. And her introduction was, she is allowing herself to have the human experience.
Nice.
And that is something that I'm so passionate about. And that's why I have these conversations about topics that most people are uncomfortable in discussing. Because for me, everything is part of the human experience. And I feel like fear is almost separating us from the immersion into the human experience, because so many of the human experience is quote unquote made wrong at the moment. When we allow ourselves to immerse into the human experience, for me personally, life started flowing. I didn't get stuck, because it's almost as though every time that I rejected something or didn't want to go through it, it was like a dam wall that was being built up. And so much was just starting to well up on the other side, which made me emotionally ill, which made me physically ill, which quite frankly screwed me up spiritually in a huge way. And when I stopped doing that, life started flowing and life started going, oh yeah, I get to feel elated and I get to feel devastated. And I don't have to make devastation wrong, because it's part of what I'm here to experience and how I get to evolve.
Exactly. Yes. Beautifully put.
You clearly have lived a lot to become an unapologetic woman and to find that center of your power. For me personally, it wasn't just one event, right? There were multiple events and they still occur. I am not at the end of my journey. I always say I'm not dead yet, so I'm not done yet. What were some of those critical moments for you, Vicki, that you chose to become unapologetic, more and more unapologetic in your life?
I think one of the things that pops into my mind, first of all, is this moment in time. I was in my, I think, 30s or so, 35, something like that. I was unhappy with a lot of what I was doing. I was very stressed. I had a couple of different jobs, and they were all really about making, trying to make a living as opposed to following through on my passion. Although I was more fortunate than most, because I never really hated what I was doing, but I was stressed. I was overextended. I was in a rut in my brain, kind of looping, this isn't working, this isn't working, this isn't working, but still trying to just grit my way through as though there was something to be gained by that. I remember I was even doing a lot of gardening at that time, and having some really amazing experiences with plants and plant spirits, which is a different story. But I was walking across the street. I had to go pick up a friend in San Francisco, which was where I was living at the time. As I was walking across the street, I glanced over my shoulder, and I saw a car coming up to a stop sign. I was jaywalking. I was in the middle, but there was no traffic around. So it was coming up to a stop sign. And so I thought, okay, no problem. I'll just keep going. I looked over my shoulder a few seconds later, realized the car hadn't stopped at the stop sign, was barreling down on me at about 30 miles an hour. So it was coming quite rapidly. So I remember at the time I was practicing a lot. I'm a martial artist, and I was practicing a lot of Qigong. And I realized I want to move, and I can't stop this. So I need to move in the same direction that it's going to hit me. The car hit me, threw me up in the air. And at that moment, time stopped. So I know a lot of people who've had car accidents say that time sort of slows down and all life flashes before their eyes. I didn't have my life flash before my eyes, but what I did experience was my consciousness shrink down to the size of the head of a pin. And that pin was located right behind my navel. And I remember, and I was sort of surprised. Somehow I had thought it would be behind my third eye or something. I don't know what I thought at the time, but I remember looking around on the inside silhouette of my body and saying, wow, I really am a seed. I'm inside of a hull, and I can either stay in this hull or I can move to another hull or do something else. It was that was one of those real changeover moments where before it wasn't, I mean, you could say that I was apologetic in the sense that I would have had to apologize to my spirit because I wasn't paying attention to what my inner voice was saying. Anyway, obviously, I decided to live at that moment. It was not a given. I had to really think about it. I decided to live. I opened my eyes. And as I opened my eyes, I was coming down to the pavement really fast. I tucked into a martial arts and Aikido roll and stood up and started doing some Qigong practice. The guy who hit me leaped out of his car, says, "What are you doing? I just hit you, lie down, lie down." And so I lay down and I continued to move energy internally. But I think that was one of those pivotal moments where they took me to the hospital. There were in an ambulance, there were all these doctors and nurses standing around saying she should be dead from that double impact of being hit at that speed and then hitting the pavement that hard. But nothing was broken. I was fine. I kind of limped a little bit out of there. I was twisted from the speed of the car hitting me, and that took a while to untwist. But basically, I walked out unscathed. And that was one of those were one of those life-changing moments where it was like, okay, I now know I need to just walk a different path. I need to move a different path. So that was one moment. I have many life-changing moments, but that was one of them.
Thank you for sharing that. As I was listening to your story and you talk about the awareness that your consciousness was in your stomach, not in your head, which is where I think majority of people think it should be, right? Your head or your heart, because we talk a lot about the heart. I recall a time when I was out running, and this was during my depression days. Wonderful experience to have gone through.
Wonderful that it's over.
I think it's wonderful in that I was diagnosed with suicidal depression, and choosing consciously to live is really powerful. Because until then, I just kind of lived because I thought I was just living. But when I consciously started understanding, no, I get to choose to live. And quite frankly, every morning I wake up, it's a conscious choice to live another day. That's really, really powerful for me. But I remember running one day and I had this vision that I had buried myself and I was in a casket, clawing at the inside of the casket to come out. And I knew in that moment that my depression was self-suppression, and it was in my stomach. It is like that is where all of my power was not in my head, was not in my heart. It was actually in my stomach. And it was only recently that I heard a spiritual teacher talk about the seat of the power being in the stomach by the navel, which is
called the lower dantian. It's called the lower dantian. Yeah.
Which I think is critical for people to start understanding, because where we bring our focus is so important in how we get to experience life. And if we are not looking after the gut area, if we're not looking after the seat of the wisdom, if we are so focused in the head and even the heart, are we not still being are we not false navigating in a sense? And that's why I don't believe that we should bring as much focus to mindset anymore. I understand that that's where the masses are, is, goodness, we need to start focusing on what's happening on the mind. But for those of us who are going beyond the mind and beyond the heart, is our next point of focus then the gut? Is that where we get to actually come into? Because I remember in martial arts, so I did kickboxing, everything was move from your core, stop moving from your arms or moving from your legs. All your power is in your core. Now I'm starting to go, it's not just your physical power, because your consciousness lies in your core.
Yeah, well, actually, I think our consciousness lies in all three of those areas, in the triple dantian, in the core, in the bowl of your pelvis, in the heart center, and in the pineal gland, third eye area. I think that there's different levels of consciousness, and the one that has to do with our power, like you said, it's physical power, but it's also a place where I think there's our gut instinct, or our gut into, kind of tuning into energies that are maybe not that more subtle, picking stuff up, having a gut feeling about something. All of that counts. So it's one level of consciousness. And I think it has to do also with our, where stagnation tends to happen, whether it's physiological stagnation from poor digestion, which is also the digesting of different information as it comes to us. It's not just the foods that we eat, but it's also what we're integrating in terms of what we learn. That all happens there in the lower dantian, and that I think that reducing it to just the body is the same thing as reducing the body, as though the body was not the source of our wisdom, as if every cell in our body didn't have information for us to pay attention to. So it's a diminishment, right? That where people say, well, that's just physical, I'm really more spiritual, or something like that. It's a false separation. And to me, in Qigong, they talk about what's called the heaven realm, which has to do with your tapping into the higher, I don't even want to call it higher power, but it could also be your spirit. It could also be just that sense of guidance that we can tap into, your wisdom. And then their heart has to do with your joy and what you love. And then the earth realm, the bottom realm, what we're talking about here, the lower dantian, has to do with what you choose to do, how you're walking your talk, what are the actions that you're taking. And when we don't have those three aligned, then I think that's when we start to really get in trouble. And I think that the lower dantian has been just described to just being about like physical power. Like if you're punching, you want to punch from that lower place. But it's also, like I said, it's the place where we integrate information. So it's really, really a critical part. And of course, I think that my consciousness went to that lower dantian at that moment in time, because my body was trying to decide whether or not it was going to survive this. So it was a body oriented recognition.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I find that there is so much information available for people at the moment, and it's almost as though people are getting to a state of information saturation, because all they do is take in information, and constantly feeling like, if I just get to know this, then so they're constantly looking for more information. And because it's so freely available at the moment, there's very little discernment or dedication almost to a master to learn from and to integrate. What are some of the practices, awarenesses that you've used in your life for the gift of wisdom? Because for me, the wisdom is always, getting the next level of information and allowing it to be practiced, allowing myself to get feedback from life, letting it being embodied and settle a little bit before searching more information. And I get the sense that that is what you do as well. You clearly very wise in your living of life, and very focused on what is the next information that I want to gain. Would you mind sharing with us some of your practice? Because I think a lot of women could gain from this.
One of the things, I have this very long-term Qigong practice, and for your listeners who don't know what Qigong is, it's a Chinese martial art that's used for healing. Well, it's really looking at how do we move energy and where and why, and it's using breath and visualization and movement. And for me, I think that the what you actually alluded to, which is to do with discernment. What is it that feeds me, or what is it that feeds you? What is it that drains you? And to be actually become very aware of that, so that the things that are draining, we can begin to filter those out. And there's actually a Qigong move where you move your hands in a circle around your heart, basically, or it's actually working with all three levels, and you're opening up the fingers, and each finger has to do with a different element of earth, water, fire, air, and ether. And it's like creating a kind of filter around your body that allows what is useful to come in. It doesn't mean that you don't get triggered or that you don't have hardship. It means it means that discernment that is able to take that down to the essence, which goes back to what we were talking about before, is how is this going to be useful? And when we're in the middle of a trauma, we're not sitting there going, oh, how could this be useful? But there is that time that we can have at some point of reflection and go, okay, I went through that. What do I want to do with it? Do I want to stay in victim mindset? Do I want to take the lesson so that it doesn't happen again? Do I want to pass that forward to other people? What am I doing with that? So that I think my one big practice for me is this concept of discernment, which in my system that I've developed called the Way of Joy, which is based on Qigong and the idea that joy is a fuel as opposed to a goal, that we can tap into joy regardless of what the circumstances are in our lives. To be able to discern what feeds me, what drains me, is probably one of the foundational things. And sometimes it's nothing more than just stopping, pausing, and breathing and listening.
Joy is a fuel, not a goal.
Yeah.
Holy shit. Please let's go there, because I see so many people unhappy and thinking that they need to have joy or happiness as
if I have the right house, if I have enough money, if I have the perfect partner, if I have, then I get to have joy. It's like the carrot at the end of the stick. But it's not. It's a life force that we're born with. Yeah, I have in my book, I talk about that. I had a student who was he was the boyfriend of a midwife, and he was going to pick up his girlfriend, and she had just delivered a baby. It was a newborn, and he was looking down at this baby, and he said to her, oh, this baby looks just like a baby Buddha. And she laughed and she said, all babies are baby Buddhas. I think that babies are born with an innate sense of joy, and until it's damaged or harmed by life, right, by whether it's abuse or neglect or other things that happen to us as we move into our lives, there is that innate sense of, I think of joy as being the embrace of all the other emotions. So for me, I don't think of joy as being just happy, yay, and denial. I really think about joy as something that we can take in, anger, sad. They think if you go to a funeral, and have you ever been to a memorial or a funeral where people start laughing and remembering this loved person, that's that there's joy in that, even in the depth of grief. Or there's joy. Sometimes anger has to do with with a sense of righteousness, of really looking for social justice, or for what is fair and what's not fair. So there's I think that that's still coming from that place of joy, of really looking for what is life. Life is all about effervescent energy that we don't even know how to we barely know how to move and direct. So Way of Joy is that is the system that I cultivated out of my many years of practice of Qigong. So that's really my own particular hybrid of how I look at the world, and there's a whole system in it. But it is, I think it's an innate fuel. I think it's a birthright. I think everybody deserves it, deserves to have it, deserves to know it. And that a lot of what we do is in relationship to whether we have it or not, or whether we can access it or not. And it doesn't have to be a big thing. It can be just like I'm looking out right now, and there's a hummingbird just hovering right in front of the window, right? Hummingbirds are symbols of joy. There's just that sense of, it can be the sound of the rain falling on leaves or on a tin roof. It can come up unexpected, delightful ways. So it doesn't have to be hooked into what we create. It's there for us. It's there for us to use, to move, to celebrate, to experience.
Yeah, I've discovered one of my joy triggers, so to speak, is butterflies. And when I see a butterfly, I'm like a child. I'm like, regardless of where I am. And I think that was one of the things that really stayed with me in my studies of yoga. Was I was doing Happy Baby once, and my teacher was saying, when you understand that this is the purpose of yoga. The purpose of yoga is not to do a headstand, Elle. The purpose of yoga is to get you back to a state of infancy.
Yes.
Because that is where you are really just in wonder and joy and presence and discovery and curiosity. And so every time I do Happy Baby, I literally look at my toes and I always start laughing, because I'm like, oh my God, if I was just born and I was seeing these crooked toes, how funny would that be? Tell me about your book. I didn't even know you had a book.
I don't talk about it very often. It's funny. The book was something that I actually I had been teaching classes, Qigong classes for quite a long time, and I was holding these monthly gatherings of everybody in my school, and was giving like a lecture and holding a facilitated discussion on these different themes that are part of my system. And at some point I decided, people kept saying, you need to write this as a book. And I was like, nah. And then I finally did. So I actually closed my school. I moved to the country and decided I was going to take 3 months to write this book. And I was happily in the second month, happily writing away. And then I got a call from my uncle, who was like a father to me. He was my mom's older brother, and he had just been diagnosed with end-stage lung cancer. And he wanted me to bring his little sister, my mom, to him so that we could be with him as he died, which I did. And which was a very sacred, amazing journey. It was the first time I had the privilege of doing some kind of death doula work. I've done it several times since then. But then I came back. When I came back, my senior student, who I was very close to, and my mom were both diagnosed with cancer. My student had end-stage lung cancer, and my mom had breast cancer. They were in the same hospital. I was running back and forth from room to room. I remember at one point, my father died. My wife's father died. I had all this happening during this course of time. And I remember a friend said to me, it's so frustrating. You're there to write this book about the way of joy, and you keep getting interrupted. And what I realized is that everything that was happening was it was like kitchen testing. If I had the audacity to say joy can be a fuel no matter what's happening, what does that mean? Not only if I'm suffering, but what does it mean when people I love are suffering, right? I'm watching them stick needles into my mom, or I'm watching my friend, I'm having to take her off life support. What does joy look like in that instance? How do you use this in this instance? So it felt like that was kitchen testing all of my theories, all of the things that I had kind of come to through my study of martial arts, and Qigong in particular, was getting tested. So the book is part stories about things that happen. I talked about actually being hit by the car in that book, as well as practices. It's a structure that I've created of 3 laws, which are the heaven realm, 3 principles, which are the human realm, 3 practices that are heaven realm. It's all about how do we embody, what are the tools to embody joy as a fuel in a daily way, no matter what's happening in your life. That's what the book is.
And the book is called
The Way of Joy.
And I'll get the link from you afterwards, and we can drop that into the description here as well. So anybody who wants to go and read that, including myself, I'm going to go get it straight after this call, would have access to that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. We can talk all day. You're one of those women that I actually want to sit with a jug of coffee or a glass of wine, or maybe
I'm down for that. I am down for that. Yes.
And just talk all day long, because my mind is on fire and going in so many directions. of where we can go. And I'm really always aware of people's time and the privilege of having them listen to this podcast. I want you to just intuitively, what is one thing that you want to say to women today?
We need you. I think all of us need you to step into your power, to really own your power presence, to be able to tell your story, be able to share your wisdom, and to be able to trust that we're out there listening and waiting for you. So I really want women to step into the leadership that I believe we're being called to do in this next era that we're in, and to recognize that even if it's hard, you are part of the transformation that the planet is so hungry to have. Absolutely. That's what I'd say.
Absolutely. I believe that's why I'm being called to self-leadership, and I believe it's a feminine art. And it took me a long time to realize, because I come from such a masculine background, that I was born to be feminine, and to create the feminine art of self-leadership, which is the leadership that the world is really, really hungry for right now. What do you take an unapologetic stand for, my friend?
Unapologetic stand for? Oh, I love that question. Let me think for just a second. Unapologetic stand for your story matters, who you are matters, what you bring matters, and that we can get through this. These are some hard times. I don't know about you, but for me, these are some hard times that we're facing on a planetary level, from everything from climate change to political divisions. And I believe that we are going to get through this, and that we need one another to do it.
Beautiful. Vicki, oh my goodness, I am so appreciative of your time, your wisdom, your generosity, your openness, your beauty, your womanhood. I'm so appreciative of you. And for saying yes to being on this podcast. I can't even begin to say thank you so much for that.
It's been an honor. It truly has. Thank you.
And to all our listeners, oh my goodness, connect with Vicki. I know I say this a lot, because have you noticed how incredible my guests are? I'm like pinching myself in the mornings. I'm like, oh my God, I get to speak to Vicki on the podcast today. I've been bouncing around this morning. But truly connect with Vicki. I think if there's one thing that I am taking away from this podcast that just hit me in the navel, was that joy is fuel. Not a goal. And what a rich fuel we have in joy. Like, seriously, can anything get our engines revving more than joy? I don't think so. And choosing to be alive today is a joy. Choosing to show up for myself today is a joy. Choosing to show up for Vicki today is a joy. Choosing to show up for you today is a joy. It's not something I ever take for granted. I think life is a privilege. So we would love to hear from you. We would love to hear about the joy in your life, your experiences that you are having, and your unfurling as an unapologetic woman. So thank you for spending this time with us. And until next week, don't forget, we get to live our legacies, unleashed, unlimited, and unapologetic. Have an amazing day further. Cheers. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at The Unapologetic Woman and on LinkedIn at Elle Nagy. And if you're interested in experiencing the Unapologetic Woman Friendwork Soiree, book in for our next open meeting at unapologetic-women.as.me/unapologetic. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.